A single sharp sound at 35,000 feet. Not the chime for the seatbelt sign, not the clatter of a service cart, but the crisp, shocking crack of a palm connecting with a cheek. Onboard Apex Air Flight 712, a flight attendant blinded by her own ambition and rage delivers a slap that will echo from the pressurized cabin to the highest corporate boardroom. She thought she was silencing a difficult passenger. She had no idea she had just assaulted the woman who owned the entire airline. This isn't just a story about a bad day at work. It's a story of how a single irreversible act of arrogance can trigger an avalanche bearing a carefully constructed life under the weight of its own consequences. Chloe Sterling considered the cabin of an Airbus A350 her kingdom. At 28, she had cultivated an image of effortless authority and flawless presentation. Her blonde hair was always pulled back into a chignon, so tight it seemed to defy gravity. Her makeup was a mask of serene professionalism, and her uniform, a deep navy blue with silver trim, was always impeccably pressed. For 5 years, she had worked for Apex Air, and in her mind, she was Apex Air. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She was a gatekeeper, a performer, and on her best days, a savior in the sky. She knew the service protocols better than the people who wrote them. She could de-escalate a confrontation over a reclining seat with the cool diplomacy of a UN ambassador and charm a first-class passenger into thinking the mediocre Chardonnay was a rare vintage. Her colleagues viewed her with a mixture of awe and fear. Newer attendants scurried to fulfill her requests while veterans gave her a wide berth. Her closest confidant on the crew was Sarah, a quiet, observant flight attendant who often found herself in Chloe's shadow, cleaning up the minor messes Chloe left in her wake. A forgotten passenger request a curt response that needed smoothing over. "You see that guy in 3A, Chloe murmured to Sarah as they prepared the galley for boarding on a Tuesday morning flight from New York to Los Angeles. "That's Michael Vance, the tech CEO. Remember to call him Mr. Vance and laugh at his jokes, even if they're terrible. He's a Diamond Medallion member, and a good report from him could fast-track my application for purser." Becoming a purser, the lead flight attendant, was Chloe's singular obsession. It meant a higher salary, more respect and control over crew assignments. It was the next step in her carefully planned ascent. Her boyfriend Mark, a junior investment banker who fetishized success, was constantly asking when she'd get the promotion. To him, her job was glamorous but ultimately service level. A leadership role would validate her in his eyes and by extension in her own. The flight to LA was a masterclass in Chloe's methods. She was a whirlwind of practiced smiles and attentive gestures in the first-class cabin. She remembered Mr. Vance's drink order from a flight 6 months prior, earning a delighted chuckle. She discreetly passed a handwritten note to a famous actress in 2D, complimenting her recent film. She was a star performer, and the front of the plane was her stage. The economy cabin, however, was another story. Back there, Chloe's smile became a thin, taut line. The passengers were not VIPs, they were obstacles. Their requests for extra blankets, their questions about connecting flights, their crying babies, it was all an irritating hum that distracted from her real work up front. She would often delegate economy duties to Sarah or other junior attendants, sweeping through only to perform the mandatory safety checks with an air of detached annoyance. On the ground in LA, as the last passengers disembarked, Sarah found a small hand-knitted baby blanket left behind in seat 34B. She picked it up. "Someone left this. We should try to find them." Chloe, busy reapplying her lipstick, glanced at it with disdain. "Just toss it in the lost and found bin. They can file a claim. It's not our job to be detectives." "But it looks handmade," Sarah pressed gently. "It might be important." "Everything is important to someone, Sarah," Chloe said, snapping her compact shut. "If we stopped for every forgotten teddy bear and scarf, we'd never leave the airport. Our job is to be on time. Efficiency. That's what management cares about. That's what gets you promoted." Later that evening, Chloe met Mark for dinner at a trendy restaurant in Beverly Hills. She regaled him with the story of charming Michael Vance. "He basically said I was the best flight attendant he's ever had," she embellished. "He's going to put in a good word for me with corporate. The purser job is practically mine." Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes gleaming with approval. "That's my girl. Always playing the game better than anyone else. You can't be successful by being nice to everyone. You have to be strategic." Chloe felt a surge of validation. Mark understood. Being nice was for people like Sarah, who would likely remain a career flight attendant, forever collecting forgotten blankets. Ambition required a certain ruthlessness. It required focusing on the people who mattered and treating the rest as part of the scenery. It was a philosophy that had served her well. She had no reason to believe that would ever change. As she sipped her expensive wine, she felt invincible, unaware that her strategy, her entire worldview was on a collision course with a quiet, unassuming woman who was at that very moment reviewing quarterly reports in an office overlooking the city and making a decision to see her company not from the top down, but from the inside out. Evelyn Reed was a ghost in her own company. At 52, she had become the CEO of Apex Air just 3 months earlier, not through a corporate climb, but through the sudden, tragic loss of her father, the airline's founder. Arthur Reed had been a titan of the industry, a charismatic leader who knew the names of his mechanics and flew on his own planes every week. He believed you couldn't run an airline from a skyscraper. You had to smell the jet fuel. Evelyn was different. She had an MBA from Stanford and a background in logistics and finance. She was a data-driven strategist, more comfortable with spreadsheets than with shaking hands. The board of directors, a cadre of men who had worked with her father for decades, viewed her with skepticism. They saw her as a temporary steward, a bookish heiress who would soon be replaced by a seasoned industry veteran. Evelyn knew this. She also knew the company her father had built was in trouble. The data told a grim story. On-time performance was slipping. Customer complaints were up 18% year over year. Employee morale, according to anonymous surveys, was at an all-time low. The reports she received from her executives were filled with corporate jargon and reassuring projections, but they didn't explain the rot she was seeing in the numbers. They were telling her what she wanted to hear, not what she needed to know. One evening, staring at a particularly bleak customer satisfaction report filled with complaints about rude cabin crew and apathetic service, she remembered her father's words. "You can't steer the ship from the crow's nest. You have to be on the deck feeling the spray." That's when she made the decision. She would fly her own airline, not as the CEO, but as a passenger. Not in the polished comfort of first class, but in the back of the plane, where the real customer experience lived and died. She would launch her own one-woman undercover audit. Her executive assistant, a discreet and loyal man named George, booked her a round-trip ticket from Los Angeles to Chicago under the name Eleanor Vance. It was a common enough name, unlikely to raise any flags. She swapped her tailored business suits for comfortable jeans, a simple gray sweater, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. She tucked her hair under a beanie and put on a pair of non-prescription glasses. Looking in the mirror, she saw not a CEO, but a tired middle-aged woman heading to visit family, the kind of passenger who was invisible to anyone seeking to impress. Her first flight from LAX to O'Hare was an exercise in quiet observation. She watched as the gate agents dealt with a delayed flight, their responses ranging from robotic indifference to outright hostility. On board, she sat in a middle seat in the second-to-last row. The flight attendant serving her section was a young man who looked exhausted. He moved with a leaden slowness, his smile never reaching his eyes. He performed his duties mechanically, avoiding eye contact, his presence more functional than welcoming. Evelyn saw a dozen small failures. A call button that went unanswered for 15 minutes. A spill in the aisle that was ignored for the entire flight. A passenger asking for water who was told to wait until the next service, nearly an hour away. These weren't catastrophic failures, but a death by 1,000 cuts. It was a culture of apathy, a system where employees felt disempowered and passengers felt like cargo. On the return flight, she found herself on Chloe Sterling's plane. Evelyn had heard Chloe's name before. It had appeared on several commendations from high-profile passengers, but also on a handful of hushed-up complaints from economy travelers who described her as dismissive and arrogant. The contradictory reports had intrigued her. Evelyn boarded early with her zone and found her window seat 2080A. From her vantage point, she had a clear view of the cabin and the crew's interactions. She watched as Chloe greeted the first-class passengers by name, her voice warm and engaging. She saw the bright, dazzling smile, the attentive posture, the masterclass in VIP service. Then she watched Chloe's transformation as she moved past the curtain into the economy cabin. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of strained tolerance. Her posture stiffened. Her movements became clipped and efficient, devoid of any warmth. She was no longer a host, she was a guard. Evelyn saw Chloe snap at a young mother struggling to fold her stroller at the jet bridge. She heard her tell an elderly man, "Sir, your bag goes wheels in, we've been over this," her tone dripping with condescension. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Evelyn felt a knot forming in her stomach. The data she had studied, the slipping satisfaction scores, the rising complaints, wasn't just numbers on a page. It had a face. It had a name. And it was currently striding down the aisle, completely unaware that the future of the airline and her own career was sitting in a window seat watching her every move. The flight had just begun, but for Evelyn, the audit was already yielding its most disturbing results. The flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was packed. Every seat was filled, and the air in the cabin was thick with the scent of recycled air and human proximity. Evelyn Reed settled into her window seat, kept her observations to herself. She made a few notes in a small, discreet notebook, logging the time it took for the crew to respond to various passenger needs. About an hour into the flight, the passenger next to Evelyn, a young man engrossed in a movie, accidentally knocked his full cup of soda onto her lap. It was a genuine accident, and he was mortified, apologizing profusely as he fumbled for napkins. "It's all right, really," Evelyn said calmly, though the cold liquid was already seeping through her jeans. "These things happen." She pressed her call button, hoping for a towel or at least some extra napkins to manage the sticky mess. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The light above her head remained illuminated, an unanswered beacon. She could see Chloe Sterling up ahead, laughing with another flight attendant. In the galley, the curtain to first class slightly ajar. After 10 minutes, Evelyn unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way toward the galley. The young man from the neighboring seat watched her, a look of guilt on his face. She paused at the edge of the galley, waiting to be acknowledged. Chloe and another attendant were complaining about their layover schedule. Finally, Chloe looked up, her expression shifting from casual conversation to mild irritation. "Can I help you?" Chloe asked, her tone implying that Evelyn was an interruption. "Yes, thank you," Evelyn said politely. "My call button has been on for about 10 minutes. There was a spill, and I just need some napkins, or a cloth, please." Chloe glanced down at Evelyn's soda-soaked jeans with a flicker of disdain. "We're preparing for the meal service. I'll get to you when I can. Please return to your seat." The dismissiveness was jarring. "I understand you're busy," Evelyn replied, her voice still even. "But it's quite a mess. A few napkins would be sufficient." This simple persistence seemed to enrage Chloe. It was a challenge to her authority. "Ma'am," she said, her voice louder now, attracting the attention of nearby passengers, "I have a service to run for over 200 people. Your spill can wait. Now please sit down." It was here that Evelyn decided to push, not out of anger, but out of a need to see how deep the problem went. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was an auditor testing a system's breaking point. "Actually," Evelyn said, her voice dropping slightly but gaining a new firmness, "Apex Air's own service protocol, Section 4, subsection B, states that passenger-initiated requests involving spills should be addressed with immediate priority to ensure cabin safety and passenger comfort. A 10-minute wait followed by a refusal is not in line with that protocol." The cabin fell silent. Sarah, the other flight attendant in the galley, looked stunned. Chloe's face, which had been a mask of irritation, flushed a deep, blotchy red. She had been called out not with emotion but with facts. Her own rules had been used against her, and by a woman in economy who looked like she shopped at a discount store. It was humiliating. "Who do you think you are?" Chloe hissed, stepping closer to Evelyn, invading her personal space. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by a venomous sneer. "You think you can quote our manual to me? I've been doing this job while you were probably clipping coupons? You don't know anything." "I know that customer service and safety are paramount," Evelyn said, holding her ground. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. This calm defiance was the final spark in Chloe's powder keg of stress, ambition, and arrogance. What happened next was a blur of motion. In a flash of uncontrolled fury, driven by the need to reassert her dominance in front of her colleague and the watching passengers, Chloe's hand shot out. Crack. The sound was sharp and ugly. It cut through the hum of the engines like a gunshot. Chloe had slapped Evelyn Reed across the face. A collective gasp went through the front of the economy cabin. Phones which had been discreetly recording the argument were now held up high. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Evelyn staggered back a step, not from the force of the blow, but from the sheer shock of it. Her cheeks stung a hot, radiating pain. But in her mind, a cold, crystalline clarity settled in. The data, the reports, the undercover audit, it had all led to this. This was the rot. This single violent act of unprofessionalism was the symptom of the entire disease she had been trying to diagnose. Chloe stood frozen for a moment, her own hand trembling in the air, as the gravity of her action began to dawn on her. The red mist of her anger started to recede, replaced by the chilling fog of fear. But it was too late. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. Evelyn slowly raised her head, her eyes locking onto Chloe's. There was no anger in her expression, no tears, no threat. There was something far more terrifying, absolute icy calm. She said nothing. She didn't need to. In the ringing silence of the cabin, surrounded by dozens of witnesses and their recording phones, Chloe Sterling's career had just ended. She just didn't know the full extent of the nightmare that was about to begin. The moment the plane's wheels touched down at LAX, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. The purser, a veteran named Maria, who had been informed of the incident mid-flight by a horrified Sarah, met them at the gate with two stern-looking airline security supervisors. Chloe, who had spent the remainder of the flight hiding in the galley trying to compose herself, attempted to seize control of the narrative. As she was escorted off the plane, away from the prying eyes of the deplaning passengers, she immediately went on the offensive. "That passenger was unhinged," she told the supervisors, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "She was aggressive, she refused to follow crew instructions, and she came at me in the galley. I felt threatened. I acted in self-defense." Evelyn, identified only as Eleanor Vance, was taken to a separate room. She remained quiet, her demeanor unnervingly placid. When asked if she wanted to press charges, she simply said, "No, I don't believe that will be necessary. I trust the airline will conduct a thorough internal investigation." She refused medical attention for the red mark on her cheek and requested only a taxi. The supervisors, accustomed to hysterical passengers, were baffled by her composure. They filed their initial report, a disruptive passenger and a flight attendant's defensive reaction. Chloe was placed on paid administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. When she told Mark what happened, she spun the same story. "It was crazy, Mark. This woman was a nobody, some troublemaker, and she got in my face. I had to put her in her place. Honestly, they should give me a medal for what we have to put up with." Mark, ever the pragmatist, was concerned. "Are you sure this won't blow back on you? Did anyone see just some other passengers and Sarah, but Sarah will back me up. She always does," Chloe said with confidence. "Corporate always sides with the crew in these he said, she said situations. I'll be back in the air in a week, you'll see." But this investigation was different. The case was flagged for review by the head of human resources, a sharp, no-nonsense man named David Chen. The initial report landed on his desk, but so did something else, a dozen emails from passengers on Flight 712. They contained links to video clips that had already been uploaded to YouTube and TikTok titled "Apex Air Flight Attendant Slaps Passenger" and "Crazy Flight Attendant Attacks Woman." David watched the videos. The audio was clear. The visuals were damning. They did not show a disruptive passenger. They showed a calm woman asking for napkins, quoting company policy, and a flight attendant escalating the situation with aggressive language before resorting to physical violence. His first call was to Sarah. Chloe had already called her, pleading with her to corroborate the self-defense story. "Just say she was being crazy, that she was yelling. Please, Sarah, my career's on the line." But facing David Chen in a sterile HR office, Sarah broke down. With tears in her eyes, she recounted the entire incident and more. She told him about Chloe's pattern of behavior, the dismissiveness toward economy passengers, the obsession with VIPs, the way she bent rules for her own benefit. "She told me to throw away a baby's handmade blanket last week because it wasn't efficient to find the owner," Sarah confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "That's Chloe, efficient about things that benefit her and careless about everything else." The investigation deepened. David Chen's team began a full audit of Chloe Sterling's 5-year record. They cross-referenced the glowing commendations from first-class passengers with the hushed-up complaints. A pattern emerged. Chloe was a Jekyll and Hyde employee. For the wealthy and influential, she was a dream. For everyone else, she was a nightmare. They discovered she had been falsifying her service reports for months, claiming to have completed full cabin checks when she had in fact been resting or chatting in the galley. They even found evidence she was taking premium cabin amenity kits and selling them online. Meanwhile, Evelyn Reed, back in her office, watched the pieces move. She had set the dominoes in motion and now observed the cascade. She received daily confidential updates from David Chen. He was unaware he was reporting to the very woman who had been slapped. To him, Eleanor Vance was just a name in a file, a victim who had mysteriously gone quiet. Evelyn convened a special meeting with the board. "Gentlemen," she began, "I have spent the last 2 weeks personally auditing our customer experience. The results are alarming." She presented a dossier of her findings. The apathy, the protocol, breaches the systemic failure to value every passenger. She did not mention the slap. She didn't have to. The board was already pale. "We have a cultural crisis," she stated, her voice resonating with an authority they had never heard from her before. "And I am going to fix it. It will begin with a top-to-bottom review of our in-flight service standards and a zero-tolerance policy for unprofessional conduct. There will be changes." 1 week after the incident, Chloe's world began to crumble. Her paid leave felt less like a vacation and more like a prison sentence. The videos were everywhere, her face a meme for corporate arrogance. Mark, seeing the negative publicity and the potential damage to his own reputation, grew distant. "This is a real mess, Chloe," he said one night. "It doesn't look good." His support was conditional, tied to her success, and her success was now very much in question. Then came the call from HR. "Ms. Sterling," David Chen's voice was cold and professional, "we have concluded our investigation. We need you to come to corporate headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for a final review meeting." Chloe's stomach turned to ice. Am I being fired?" "We will discuss the findings of the investigation and the resulting actions tomorrow," was his only reply. Chloe hung up the phone, a sliver of her old arrogance still intact. They would give her a final warning, maybe some mandatory anger management classes. They couldn't fire her. She was too good, too valuable. She had brought in too much revenue from the front of the plane. She would go and apologize and accept her penance. She had no idea that she wasn't walking into a simple HR meeting. She was walking into her day of judgment. The 24 hours leading up to Chloe's meeting at Apex Air headquarters were a slow-motion collapse of the life she had so carefully constructed. The first pillar to fall was Mark. He came over that evening not with words of comfort, but with a cold finality in his eyes. He stood in the middle of her pristine apartment, refusing to sit down. "I can't do this, Chloe," he said, his voice flat. "My firm, my reputation, I can't be associated with this." "Associated with what?" Chloe shot back, her voice rising with panic. "A lie, a video taken out of context. I thought you believed me." "I believe in success," Mark replied, and the cruelty of his honesty struck her harder than the slap she had delivered. "I believe in a good image. This," he gestured vaguely, encompassing her. "The videos, the scandal, is the opposite of that. The people I work with are talking about it. It's a joke. I'm sorry, it's over." He left without another word. The click of the door shutting echoed the sound of her future closing. The man whose approval she had craved, the reason she had pushed so hard for the purser position, had abandoned her the moment her image was tarnished. The next morning, sleep-deprived and shaken, Chloe tried to piece together her professional armor. She put on her most severe business suit, applied her makeup like a warrior preparing for battle, and pulled her hair back into its signature unforgiving chignon. But as she looked in the mirror, she saw cracks in the facade. Her eyes were puffy and a nerve twitched at the corner of her mouth. Her confidence, once a roaring fire, was now a flickering ember. She had called Sarah twice the night before, but her calls went straight to voicemail. Her friends from the crew had gone silent. The isolation was a physical weight pressing down on her as she drove to the sprawling Apex Air corporate campus near the airport. She walked through the gleaming impersonal lobby, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The building itself seemed to mock her, a monument to the career she felt slipping through her fingers. She was directed to the executive wing on the top floor, which she found strange. HR meetings were usually held in the less intimidating administrative buildings. A silent assistant led her down a long, carpeted hallway, lined with portraits of the airline's history. There was Arthur Reed, the founder, smiling broadly from a black and white photo. Chloe barely glanced at it. She was rehearsing her apology, her carefully worded explanation that would smooth everything over. The assistant stopped in front of a pair of large, imposing oak doors. "They're waiting for you in the main boardroom, Ms. Sterling." The boardroom, a cold dread far worse than any she had felt before, washed over her. This was not a standard HR review. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The room was vast, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table. Seated along one side were David Chen from HR and Maria the purser from her flight. At the head of the table, in the large leather chair, usually reserved for the CEO, sat a woman. The woman looked up as Chloe entered. She wore a simple but impeccably tailored navy blue dress. Her hair was styled elegantly, and her face was calm and composed. The only thing marring her appearance was a faint, yellowish-green bruise high on her left cheekbone. It was the woman from the plane, Eleanor Vance. Chloe froze in the doorway, her rehearsed speeches dissolving into dust in her throat. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The frumpy, middle-aged woman from economy was sitting at the head of the Apex Air boardroom table. It made no sense. The woman gestured to the single empty chair across the table from her. "Please, Ms. Sterling, have a seat." Her voice was the same, calm, steady, but now it held an unmistakable ring of power. The same voice that had quoted company policy to her just before the slap. Chloe moved toward the chair as if in a trance. She sat down stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. Her eyes darted from the woman to David Chen, who looked at her with an expression of grim pity. "I believe we've met," the woman said, her eyes boring into Chloe's. "Though under less formal circumstances. My name is not Eleanor Vance. My name is Evelyn Reed." The name hit Chloe like a physical blow. Evelyn Reed, the daughter of the founder, the new CEO, the ghost in the machine who no one had ever really seen. The room began to spin. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. Every piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. The undercover flight, the quiet observation, the calm probing questions, the lack of reaction after the assault. It hadn't been the behavior of a random passenger. It had been the assessment of an owner inspecting her own broken property. The queen of the cabin had slapped the empress of the entire empire. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. There were no more lies to tell, no narrative to spin. She was utterly, completely, and irrevocably exposed. The unraveling was complete. All that was left was the judgment. The silence in the Apex Air boardroom was a physical entity. It was thick and heavy, pressing in on Chloe Sterling from all sides, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She sat rigidly in a plush leather chair that felt more like an electric chair. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. The vast polished mahogany table stretched before her like a desolate sea, and on the other side sat her inquisitors, David Chen from HR, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Maria the purser, her expression etched with a deep, weary disappointment. And at the head of it all, in the seat of absolute power, the woman from seat 28A. Chloe's mind scrambled for a logical explanation. This had to be a setup, some bizarre, elaborate intimidation tactic. Perhaps this woman, this Eleanor Vance, was a highly valued customer, a secret shopper with immense influence, and the company was putting on this grand show to appease her. Yes, that had to be it. She would apologize profusely, accept a suspension, and this nightmare would end. She clung to this theory as a drowning sailor clings to a piece of driftwood. The woman at the head of the table let the silence stretch, a masterful tool of psychological warfare. Finally, she folded her hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning Chloe to her seat. "I believe we've met," she said, her voice the same calm, steady tone that had so infuriated Chloe on the flight. "Though under less formal and certainly less pleasant circumstances. I feel I owe you a proper introduction. My name is not Eleanor Vance." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air before delivering the final catastrophic blow. My name is Evelyn Reed. The name detonated in the silent room. Reed, the name emblazoned on the side of every plane, on every uniform, on the very building she was sitting in. Evelyn Reed, the daughter, the heir, the new CEO. The driftwood of Chloe's theory shattered, and she was plunged into an icy ocean of reality. The blood drained from her face and a roaring sound filled her ears. Her entire body went cold. It wasn't a setup to appease a passenger. It was a verdict being delivered by the Queen herself. Every detail of the encounter on the plane replayed in her mind, now cast in a horrifying new light. The unassuming clothes, the quiet observation, the precise quoting of the company manual, the unnerving calm after the assault. It had all been a test, a final exam she had failed in the most spectacularly public and violent way imaginable. For 3 months, Evelyn Reed continued, her voice cutting through Chloe's internal chaos. I have been living in a world of spreadsheets and executive summaries telling me that this airline, my father's legacy, was fundamentally sound. But the numbers beneath the surface told a different story. Customer complaints are up 18%. Employee turnover in the cabin crew division is the highest it's been in a decade. Brand loyalty is eroding. The reports gave me excuses, but no real answers. So I decided to get the answers myself. She gestured toward a large screen on the wall that had been dormant. David Chen pressed a button on a remote. Chloe's own face, contorted in a mask of ugly rage, filled the screen. The video from the passenger's phone played out in crystal clear, high definition. The sound was impeccable. Her hissing voice, "Who do you think you are?" followed by the sharp, sickening crack of her hand hitting Evelyn's face. A collective faint gasp came from the other side of the table, even though they had surely all seen it before. Chloe flinched as if she'd been struck herself. Being forced to watch her own violent loss of control was a unique and profound form of torture. When the screen went dark, Evelyn's eyes were on her again, cold and analytical. Your actions on that flight, Miss Sterling, were not an isolated incident of a bad day. We have come to learn they were the apex of a long-established pattern. David Chen slid a thick file across the table. The investigation was comprehensive, he stated, his voice flat. We cross-referenced 5 years of your service records with passenger feedback. The commendations all came from first or business class. The complaints, many of which were dismissed by your previous supervisor, came exclusively from the main cabin. We have a statement from a Mr. Henderson, an elderly gentleman you belittled for placing his bag incorrectly. We have one from a Mrs. Gable, a young mother you berated at the gate. And then there are the service logs. He opened the file. For at least 8 months, you have been falsifying your service reports, claiming to complete full cabin comfort and safety checks, when flight data recorders show you were inactive in the galley for long stretches. This is not just poor service, it is a direct breach of safety protocol. Maria the purser spoke for the first time, her voice heavy with regret. Ms. Reed, the crew, they were afraid of her. The junior attendants would rather handle a difficult situation themselves than ask Chloe for help, because they knew she would either ignore them or mock them. The atmosphere she created was one of fear, not teamwork. That is a danger at 35,000 feet. Evelyn nodded, absorbing Maria's words before turning her attention back to Chloe. And then, of course, there is the matter of the theft. David Chen slid a printed list of online auction sales across the table. Chloe's stomach plummeted as she saw the familiar names of the premium amenity kits, the expensive noise-canceling headphones, the high-end liquor miniatures, all sold from an account linked directly to her bank. The evidence was absolute. The case was hermetically sealed. There was no defense. There was nothing left but the sentence. Therefore, Evelyn said, her voice lowering into a register of pure finality, your employment with Apex Air is terminated effective immediately. The words, though expected, hit Chloe with the force of a physical blow. That is, however, merely the first consequence. Evelyn continued, her calm demeanor, making the pronouncements even more terrifying. Because you chose to physically assault a customer, and because you have stolen from this company, we will be turning over our entire investigation file, including the video and the evidence of theft, to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for their review. We will recommend they pursue all applicable charges. Chloe's breath hitched. Criminal charges. Furthermore, a full and detailed report of this incident, which represents a catastrophic failure of professional conduct and judgment, will be filed with the Federal Aviation Administration. We will not contest their inevitable decision, which will almost certainly be the permanent revocation of your flight attendant license. You will not be serving on a flight for this airline or any other U.S. carrier ever again. Blacklisted. Finished. A professional pariah. Evelyn slowly rose from her chair, her presence commanding the entire room. Today, I am announcing a new company-wide initiative, the Arthur Reed Standard of Service. It is founded on my father's core belief that every single person who buys a ticket with us is a guest in our home. Their ticket price is irrelevant to their right to be treated with dignity. We will retrain every employee. We will change how we reward our staff. We will rebuild the trust that you and others like you have broken. She walked around the table and stopped directly in front of the shattered Chloe, who could not bring herself to look up from the polished surface of the table. You built your career on a foundation of contempt for people you deem beneath you. Evelyn said, her voice now quiet for Chloe's ears only. You thought power came from the fear you inspired and the VIPs you impressed. That is not power. It is weakness. True authority is earned through respect. You have shown none, and now you have none. She paused, letting the final words sink in. Your service to this company is over, Miss Sterling, but you have performed one final invaluable service. You have shown me exactly where the rot is, and you have given me the mandate to cut it out. For that, you have my thanks. Evelyn Reed turned without a backward glance and walked out of the boardroom, her footsteps echoing with purpose. She left Chloe Sterling utterly alone in the center of the silent room, a fallen queen in a kingdom she had burned down with her own two hands. Chloe Sterling walked out of the Apex Air boardroom, but she did not feel the plush carpet under her feet. She was floating in a state of pure, unadulterated shock, a ghost haunting the hallway of a life that was no longer hers. The silent assistant who had let her in was waiting, and escorted her not to the lobby but to a small, sterile office, where a security guard stood by a cardboard box. He didn't speak, merely gesturing to the desk where her personal effects from her flight locker had been unceremoniously dumped: a tube of half-used lipstick, a spare pair of pantyhose, a dog-eared copy of a trashy novel, and a framed photo of her and Mark smiling their brilliant false smiles, the artifacts of a dead career. She was instructed to turn in her ID badge and parking pass. The plastic card, which had once felt like a key to the world, was now just a useless rectangle. As the security guard clipped it from its lanyard, Chloe felt a physical severing. She was no longer Chloe Sterling, flight attendant. She was just Chloe. The thought was terrifying. The drive home was a blur. She navigated the familiar freeways of Los Angeles on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom of Evelyn Reed's face, the sickening crack of the slap replaying on a loop, and the cold clinical words, District Attorney, FAA, permanent revocation. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of minimalist chic that she and Mark had curated, now felt like a stranger's home. It was his name on the lease, his credit card that had paid for the sleek furniture. She was an unauthorized guest in the museum of her own failure. For 2 days, she didn't leave. She didn't answer her phone, which buzzed intermittently with texts from blocked numbers, reporters, online trolls who had found her number, and a single pitying message from a former colleague that read, "I'm so sorry." On the third day, a certified letter arrived. It was from a downtown law firm formally notifying her that the Apex Air Legal Department had submitted a case file against her to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, citing petite larceny and assault. The paper felt cold and heavy in her hands, a formal declaration of war against a person who had already unconditionally surrendered. The dream of being a purser was a distant, laughable fantasy. The new dream was simply staying out of jail. Panic gave way to frantic action. She needed a lawyer, which meant she needed money. She began selling her possessions online: designer handbags, shoes, the expensive watch Mark had given her for their anniversary. Each sale felt like chipping away a piece of her old identity, dismantling the facade she had worked so hard to build. The woman who once judged passengers by their attire was now haggling with strangers over the price of a second-hand purse. Meanwhile, at Apex Air, the Arthur Reed Standard of Service was rolling out with the force of a revolution. Evelyn Reed, no longer a ghost, was a visible and decisive leader. She appeared in new training videos, her demeanor warm but firm. "My father believed this airline was a family," she said, looking directly into the camera. "And in a family, you treat everyone with dignity, not because of the seat they're in, but because of the respect they deserve as a human being." The message resonated. Morale, which had been in a death spiral, began to tick upward. Employees felt seen. The new bonus structure, which rewarded positive feedback from all cabins, incentivized a holistic approach to service. Sarah, the quiet attendant who had witnessed the slap, found herself thriving in the new environment. Her natural empathy and dedication, once seen as inefficient liabilities by Chloe, were now celebrated as core company values. She was promoted to a training role tasked with teaching new hires the very principles of decency Chloe had scorned. During one training session, a new recruit asked her, "What happened to that flight attendant from the video? The one who, you know." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "She forgot the most important rule of this job," she said, her voice soft but clear, "that the uniform doesn't make you powerful. It makes you responsible. We are responsible for the safety, comfort, and dignity of every single person who steps onto our plane." She lost sight of that, and she lost everything because of it. The media, which had feasted on the scandal, now pivoted to a story of corporate redemption. Forbes ran a feature on Evelyn Reed titled, "The Heiress Apparent: How a Slap in the Face Saved an Airline." The stock price for Apex Air, after an initial dip, began to climb steadily. Evelyn had not just purged a toxic employee, she had performed a successful corporate exorcism, and Wall Street was applauding. 6 months later, Chloe's world had shrunk to the size of a one-bedroom apartment in the San Fernando Valley, paid for with the last of her savings. The legal battle had drained her finances. Her lawyer had managed to get the assault charge dropped, citing her immediate termination as sufficient punishment, but the DA was proceeding with the theft charge. Her court date was looming. The FAA had, as predicted, permanently revoked her license. She was officially irreversibly grounded. Her days were a monotonous cycle of searching for jobs and facing rejection. Her name was now infamous in any customer-facing industry. The viral video was her digital scarlet letter. Finally, out of desperation, she took the only job she could get, working the evening shift at a 24-hour diner off the I-5, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of stale coffee and grease. The Chloe who had once demanded perfection was now the one serving burnt coffee to weary truckers and refilling ketchup bottles. The tight chignon was gone, her hair pulled back in a simple frayed ponytail. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were now raw and chapped from the harsh dish soap. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, praying no one would recognize her. Sometimes a customer would be rude, snapping their fingers for a refill or complaining about the food. In those moments, a phantom memory of her own past behavior would rise up, and she would feel a hot flush of shame so intense it made her dizzy. She was learning humility on an hourly basis, paid in minimum wage and pitting looks. One Tuesday night during a lull, she was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. A woman in a crisp Apex Air purser uniform walked in her stride, confident, and her smile tired but genuine. It was Sarah. Chloe froze, her hand gripping the wet rag. For a moment, she considered bolting into the kitchen, hiding until she left. But there was nowhere to go. Sarah approached the counter, her eyes scanning the menu on the wall before they landed on Chloe. Recognition dawned in Sarah's eyes, followed not by triumph or scorn, but by a flicker of surprise and something that looked like sorrow. The power dynamic between them had been completely seismically inverted. Chloe was the one in the apron holding the coffee pot. Sarah was the customer, the professional, the one who had ascended while Chloe had plummeted. "Chloe," Sarah said, her voice quiet. Chloe could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "I'll just have a black coffee to go, please," Sarah said gently, sliding a $5 bill onto the counter as if it were a normal transaction between strangers. With trembling hands, Chloe poured the coffee. As she put the lid on the cup, her eyes met Sarah's. In that moment, Chloe didn't see a rival or a victor. She saw a mirror of the person she could have been: decent, respected, and content. She saw the value in the simple kindness she had always dismissed as weakness. "That'll be $2.50, Chloe managed to choke out. "Keep the change," Sarah said softly. She picked up the cup. "Take care of yourself, Chloe." And then she was gone, the bell chiming her departure. Chloe stood clutching the $5 bill, staring at the empty doorway. It wasn't pity she felt from Sarah or even forgiveness. It was a simple, profound gesture of grace. It was the kind of decency she had never shown anyone, and receiving it now at the absolute nadir of her life was more devastating than any punishment. The tears she had held back for months finally came silent drops falling onto the grimy counter. The fall was over. She had hit the ground. And in the wreckage, for the very first time, she began to understand that the kingdom she had lost was not the cabin of an airplane, but the simple shared ground of human decency. So what can we take away from the story of Chloe Sterling and Evelyn Reed? It's a stark reminder that our true character isn't defined by how we treat the powerful, but by how we treat those we believe have no power over us. Chloe's ambition wasn't her fatal flaw. Her arrogance was. She believed her worth was determined by the VIP she impressed, forgetting the hundreds of other eyes that were always watching. The quiet passenger in 28A, the junior attendant cleaning up her messes, the anonymous faces in the cabin, they all mattered. In our own lives, whether we work in an office, a restaurant, or an airplane, we are constantly faced with the choice to act with kindness or contempt. This story shows that a single thoughtless moment of disrespect can trigger an unstoppable chain reaction with devastating consequences. The universe has a funny and often harsh way of balancing the books. If this story gave you chills or made you think, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true life stories of drama and consequence. What would you have done if you were a passenger on that flight? Let me know in the comments below.